All right, what's up, Rage Nation guys? This is the very first interview that I have done on my own. We didn't have Knox intro because if you guys notice, he's kind of helping out in the backstage, making sure everything runs. He's gonna pop in at the end. But for today, it's actually just Garte and I here to have a conversation. No idea where it's going to take us. At the beginning, he said he wanted to talk a little bit about like the philosophy of science. As you guys know, we were in a four-way debate not too long ago. And yeah, I reached out to him over in the side chat, and he was gracious enough to come on. So welcome, Cy. If you want to give a brief introduction of yourself, I'm sure folks here are fairly familiar with you.
Well, thanks for having me on. And I'm a retired research scientist in the biological sciences. My PhD's in biochemistry. I retired about 5 or 6 years ago. I recently published a book called The Works of His Hands. And the subtitle tells it all. It's a scientist's journey from atheism to faith. So the book tells about how I started out as an atheist from my family, who were all atheists, and eventually, over a long period of time, came to Christian faith, largely through science, but also through some personal experiences. And besides the book, I'm also the editor of God and Nature, which is a quarterly magazine put out by the American Scientific Affiliation, and that takes a fair bit of my time.
I assume so. I've done just freelance editing. That's a lot of work.
Well, I'm lucky that I have a fantastic actual in-house editor who's my wife. She does the heavy lifting of the editing. She's much better at it than I am, but I have the title because I have to do all the fun stuff like, get people to send in stuff and reject people and accept people and all that kind of thing. But the actual editing, I just do a little bit. It's hard. It's hard to edit, right? You know that.
Oh yeah. Especially if it's your own work. Like, I can edit somebody else's. You can see the mistakes that other people make, but like your own words get so familiar to you that like you lose it. I write fiction primarily. I have written some nonfiction. I've primarily done stuff like reviews and some essays. I've written an article or two here or there, but the vast majority of what I've written is fiction. So like my editing skills are primarily aimed on that side of things.
Yeah, well, I think there isn't anyone in the business who will tell you that you should edit your own work, no matter what you're writing and no matter who you are. I mean, everybody needs an external editor for the reason you just said. I mean, you write something and, the idea of changing it just seems, no, I'm not going to change it. It's good.
Well, and it's not even just that. It's that you have a lot of verbal tics and habits that feel natural to
That's
you,
right.
and an editor can kind of pick those up and cut them out.
Exactly. I know quite a few of the ones I have.
So you said that you wanted to talk a little bit about the philosophy of science, and I think we'll get there, but there was something else that you mentioned. I had mentioned to you at the beginning when we were kind of backstage that I might end up in a debate with Nephilim Free sometime soon on Modern Day Debate, and you said that you had some interesting thoughts about that format and about what works and what doesn't. So if you'd like to start there, I think that that's something that our viewership would be definitely interested in talking about, just because you've been in a few debates yourself, weirdly enough, on the evolution side, which is interesting for, a Christian. Like, I know that as a polytheist, it's weird that I'd be on the evolution side, but I absolutely I can't even say I believe in it, right? Because there's so much evidence that it's not necessarily about believing in it or not.
Right. Yeah, I mean, well, I should also probably just dispel this idea that it's strange for a Christian to be in favor of evolution, because as far as I know, depending on where you are, the majority of Christians really do accept evolution. There is a large, very vocal group, mostly from the Southern Baptist and Seventh-day Adventists and a few other denominations, who reject evolution completely. But most of the other denominations have statements that say, including the Catholic Church, which is pretty big, that say that, evolution is not inconsistent with Christian belief. So,
well, and I do want to say, I was commenting more that it's strange that you are a Christian on the evolution side of a debate on evolution involving.
Oh yeah,
Christian.
yeah, that's
right.
I
think because most of the time debates on evolution, you usually don't have an atheist on the anti-evolution side, right? Like there are a few that don't believe in that, but like most of the time it's these sort of fundamentalist Christian types that are anti-evolution. A young earth creationist movement. So that's more what I was commenting on, rather than, it's strange that a Christian would believe in evolution, so to speak.
Yeah. Well, and that brings up my point, is since I've debated with Nephilim Free and with Kent Hovind, and there's one other whose name I forgot. I think I've learned a little bit about how you. Well, I certainly have learned what not to do, and what doesn't really work is to explain to them all the facts that back up the idea of evolution, because they're not interested in that. They don't even hear it. To me, I think one of the important things is to make one thing very clear, and that is to define what it is when you say evolution, because they don't understand it. And in fact, my view is that most people in general, whatever their positions are, don't really know what is meant when we talk about biological evolution. I didn't mention that I have a new YouTube channel that has about 7 or 8 videos up now, and I'm in the process of making another one. And what it's going to be called is What Evolution Is Not.
Yeah, because like that is something that happens a lot,
It does, right.
We were talking a little bit about like the titles in a lot of these debates, kind of in the side chat and in Discord and things earlier. And one of the big things that I've seen over and over is, like evolution. A lot of creationists will equate evolution to abiogenesis. They'll equate it to Big Bang Theory. They'll try to lump them all in as one big boogeyman enemy. But like abiogenesis is one theory among many for how the process of evolution could have gotten started. Evolution just describes the process.
Exactly.
Like it's not. It doesn't have a particular end or goal or anything else. It is the process by which species emerge.
I mean, in the debate with Hovind, I remember him saying, well, I don't see how an elephant can turn into a donkey or a pine tree. And I've heard that from many places.
Fish to fisherman. Like that's one of the big flat platitudes you hear is fish to fisherman evolution.
Yeah. And the reality is that, in fact, evolution requires that an animal only gives birth to the same kind of animal. So the idea that an animal turns into another animal is actually completely against the idea of evolution, biology, anything. And if you can get that simple point across, you're already ahead of the game, because they don't understand that. And what they will then ask you, if you say, no, you're right, a dog only gives birth to dogs, cats only to cats, elephants only to elephants. Absolutely true across the board. No question about it. It has to be true. And then they'll ask you, well, then what are you talking about? Then how can you say that, we all came from, whatever, from slime or from, bacteria or whatever. And that's where the challenge is, because now you have to explain the process of evolution, which has nothing to do with one thing turning into another thing or giving birth to another thing. It has to do with changes in populations that are separated from each other, so they can't interbreed. And you have a process of what they like to call microevolution, which they all agree happens. But the microevolution occurs differently in the two different populations, which are now separated. And if that goes on long enough, okay, instead of some kind of a large cat, you now have one population of that large cat, which looks like a lion, and the other population look like tigers. And that takes a lot of time, and it's all microevolution over and over again.
Well, and neither of those populations started off as a lion or a tiger.
Exactly.
They started off as something that
something
was,
else,
something that shared characteristics with both lions and tigers.
Exactly.
That lots of tiny, minute changes.
I think that's the best way in. And once you get that across, a lot of problems go away. I think. I haven't tried it yet, but I think that might help.
Well, I think the big challenge also is when you start talking about the major extinction events. Like we had it on our channel not too long ago, and keep in mind I'm a polytheist. This is a theist talking to another theist about evolution. So this is again so unusual for the internet for this sort of thing. But the other day we had somebody on who was asking, so how can a population bottleneck actually lead to an explosive growth, evolution wise, and trying to explain how, say a mass extinction then opens up a bunch of biological niches, which would then allow the remaining species to speciate further because there's a smaller breeding population, meaning that any genetic variance between that breeding population is more likely to be carried on into future generations. And also with less competition, it's more likely that those genetic variants might actually lead to taking over a new ecological niche. It's very difficult to get that across when, you're to communicate that to somebody who may not have as much of a grounding in that sort of theory.
Right. That's you're right. That's hard to get across. And I think so. If I ever do another debate with a creationist, and I don't know if I will, but if I do, I'm going to drop that whole approach and simply try to get across, and that's what I'm going to try to do in this video that I'm making, is just define what evolution is not. And like you said, it's not the Big Bang. It's not the origin of life. It's not the change from rotary phones to smartphones. All of that stuff is change, and it has some sort of evolutionary pathway, but none of it follows the biological and biochemical background of evolution, which is, or the core of evolution, which is very specific to cellular life. Okay, not the origin of life, but once you have cells that are alive, then you have evolution starting. And all specific to that. They don't apply to anything else. And that's so hard to get across. But if you can get that across, yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, and I'm going to say, and one could argue that even before, because there's a debate still about whether or not viruses qualify as life, right? But currently, the pandemic that is growing in my lungs, right? That is also itself a product of evolution. There were mutations that happened that caused this to jump from, right now they think it's bats to pangolins to humans. That is, it is itself, it's a pandemic we have never seen before. And even quote, non-life, this sort of in between, before you get cellular life, you had viruses, or at least that's kind of one of the theories that's out there. That still happens. That process still happens. So we can observe it in real time right now. Anybody who denies evolution, how the fuck did COVID end up in my lungs, guys? Come on.
Yeah, I mean, that's a disturbing and painful example, but you're right. Whether a virus is alive or not, I've had some discussions about that, and it's a matter of semantics and what you mean by life. So that'll never get answered. But there are at least one very prominent abiogenesis researcher who is proposing that viruses predated cellular life and may be involved in the origin of cellular, what we call life. I don't know enough about that to know if that's likely or reasonable, but it might be.
I don't think anybody knows enough about it, to be honest. I think I was reading about some of the research that was done in 2014, and It is fascinating. They managed to, I believe it was, create RNA from, like conditions that could have existed in the early
Yeah.
sort of fireball Earth stage. Basically, that Darwin's warm little pond idea, where it was like water washed over and then dried up and washed over and dried up, and then eventually phosphorus got added, and suddenly RNA. So, like, the building blocks of life could have come that way, but we still don't know. Like, abiogenesis is, again, one of a couple of different theories I've seen for the origins of life. I think that evolution doesn't necessarily deal with the origins, and
No.
I think that that's the most important point. If you want to debate evolution, talk to me about evolution. Don't talk to me about abiogenesis. Don't talk to
Right.
me about the freaking Big
Exactly.
Bang. Because, like, I can even grant the Big Bang, like, with my definition of the gods, and still they're still gods, right? Like, it's possible to have a conceptualization of deity that doesn't rely on the creation of the universe as well.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah, I think if you can get across, maybe I'll have my video up by then and you can watch it and see if that helps. But if you can get across this idea of the limitation of what we mean when we say evolution, that would be very useful. And when I speak to other Christians about this, as you said, the creationists, once they understand that we're talking about a fairly limited theory that doesn't encompass everything, in nature, for them, I'm hopeful that they might begin to see that it's not really such a stretch to go from there to even the tenets of Christian faith or any other religious faith. So I don't know. It's just a guess, but I would suggest that that's the most important issue to get across: is what do we mean by evolution, and what is not, what doesn't count. And try it and see. Do you know when you're doing this debate, or it's still up in the
yet.
air?
It's kind of up in the air, given that I do have this,
Right,
and I may or may
right.
not end up in the hospital. Like they're saying with my husband, how sick he is, he might be another 6 weeks of recovery just from the damage that the pneumonia he has did to his lungs already. So, like, I don't know where I'm gonna end up. I'm in the first few days. I'm trying not to schedule anything right now. I have two different debates that we're trying to get scheduled, but like, unfortunately, I went from let's get this scheduled soon to, hey, we might want to kind of put off talking about a date until I know that I'm not dead yet.
No.
Morbid humor, but
No,
that's where I'm
yeah.
at.
This is just so terrible. I don't know.
But I think you gave us a really good transition into kind of the discussion that you initially said you wanted to have about, like, the philosophy of science, because
Okay.
I think that that's another thing that a lot of like creationists misunderstand. There's this idea the Bible deals to a certain degree in absolutes. Absolutely, this, like,
Right.
this person died for your sins, absolutely this is what is moral, right and wrong. But I don't think that science necessarily does. Like, I often say that science deals in most probable explanations,
Right.
and testable hypotheses, not an absolute. So when you start saying science has proven something, like, you clearly have a misunderstanding of science. And I'm taking pot shots at the press here in my own field. So I'm curious what your thoughts are on that sort of expression, and, like, from there, where you would like to go with the discussion about science and philosophy, because philosophy is a deep passion of mine.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot to say about that.
Well, I mean,
in fact, I'm very interested in your take on part of this, because I've been reading a number of very interesting scholarly books on, and some of them historical, about the whole issue of the scientific worldview of origins, and also just how the world works in a general sense. And one of the books I'm reading is by Roger Penrose, who is probably one of the most important or most famous physicists when we talk about, writing for the public. Although his writing is not easy, it's very technical, but he does.
He's right there with, like, Stephen Jay Gould and Dawkins in terms of, like, scientific writing.
I think he goes a little deeper than either of them. And so, well, that's because they write about biology.
I was about to say, it depends on which papers you're talking about. Like, if you're talking about the essay collections, Hen's Teeth and Horse's Toes and Wonderful Life in particular get pretty deep.
Yeah, they do.
And so does The Ancestor's Tale, which, a lot of people when they think Dawkins, they think the God Delusion. I never read the God Delusion,
No,
funnily
it's
enough.
not.
Like, I read Ancestor's Tale and Selfish Gene, and both of those are fascinating books.
The Ancestor's Tale is actually one of my favorite books. I mean,
It's same here. It's so
I
brilliantly written.
it covers so much, and it's so well. Dawkins is a great writer. I've known him for decades, and obviously I'm not happy with his theological views, but his biology is first class. And although some of it's a little outdated now, but the Ancestor's Tale will never go out of style because it really does
Well, it's one of the
dive
most
deeply.
compelling arguments for evolution
Yeah,
out there. All
yeah,
of this shared DNA basically walking us back from our
yeah,
closest living relatives genetically all the way back to, our theoretical common ancestor, and jumping from, familiar species to familiar species. That whole like fish to fisherman evolution thing, it
right.
literally spells that out in your DNA, like reading your fucking genes. And that is like such a brilliant approach. Like, I think every single, like Christian needs to read the Ancestor's Tale, not the God Delusion, not the Selfish Gene, but the Ancestor's Tale, in order to get a grounding in, at the very least, the genetics argument for evolution, because that's,
Yeah,
well, I'm not going to ramble. I wanted you to talk, but like, there's part of the problem with talking about evolution and trying to deny it is much like climate change. There's so many different branches of science that come together
yeah,
and
that's
to the
true.
same consensus, that like trying to talk about it, you can attack it. Like, you can attack the fossil angle, and then now you've got the genetic angle to deal with, and you can attack like, the fetal development angle, which has itself some problems, and you still have to contend with, the actual physical evidence of things like, say, COVID-19 and stuff like that. Like, there's just too many different places where you'd have to debunk a boatload of arguments in order to disprove evolution. Like, it's not possible. It's eminently observable.
Right. I mean, I want to get back to something you said about Dawkins. I mean, I used to, I used to work with DNA. I mean, I used to work with genes, and most of my research involved genetic things. So I was very much a pro DNA person. You probably know this, but I don't know if everyone does. The whole field of abiogenesis has always been split in two, with some people thinking that you had to have metabolism first before you had any DNA or RNA or anything that replicated. That's called metabolism first. And then the other group believes that replicators came first. And Dawkins is a leading proponent of that, always has been. Now,
well, and what little research I've seen in the field seems to point more toward the replicator side from what I've read, just because we were able to synthesize in the lab, we being, the like the wider human race, I guess, were able to synthesize RNA in the lab, or at least the components of RNA in the lab under similar conditions. So far, that is the one thing that has like very heavily showcased anything. I haven't seen anything like later than that.
well, yeah, but that's not the problem. I mean, making precursors for RNA and even making small polymers of RNA is not that hard. The real problem is getting RNA to replicate itself. And how do you do that before you have enzymes and proteins? And that's a real trick we don't know the answer to. So, there isn't anything that goes on in the cell, including DNA replication, including the synthesis of proteins, that does not require enzymes. And enzymes are proteins, so something has to make them. So the metabolism first folks have a good point. And as I was saying, I originally agreed totally with Dawkins and you that replicators must have come first. I'm not so sure anymore. I'm not really on board completely with. I mean, the selfish gene is a great idea, but it implies a gene-centric view of biology, to the point where, as Dawkins himself says, is that basically we are all just the baggage that a DNA molecule carries with it so that it can replicate itself. And that's one way to look at it, and it makes some scientific sense. But
Yeah,
that's a very good question by
yeah.
Raging Atheist, and that
Well,
is
no, that's a question by Athena. Like he was tagging a raging atheist so that we would see it.
Oh, okay, sorry. Okay, great. So I think that there have been some very good theories proposed. I forgot the name of the guy now, but that they evolved together, which is tricky. But I think that's probably right, because in some form or other. So in other words, the metabolism may have been fairly primitive. The replicators probably were very primitive, but it's probably silly to say it was all this and then the other thing came, and or whatever. So it's probably some very complicated combination of the two all at once. And but who knows? I mean,
but I mean, it's kind of like the steady state evolution versus punctuated equilibrium. There's probably it's probably a combination of the two.
Yeah, it is.
Right. For the other. Steady state does not generally allow for punctuated equilibrium, whereas punctuated equilibrium by its nature allows for steady state.
Exactly. Right. And that's right. That's exactly right.
So for folks in the chat who are not as up on certain terminology, this is a feud that was more between followers than Dawkins and Gould themselves, for the idea that evolution could occur in bursts after major extinction events and other disruptions to an ecosystem, and then go back to a sort of, quote, steady state, as Dawkins would put it, versus the idea that evolution only occurs in micro changes throughout large populations at all times that ultimately, results in speciation. I mean, personally, I think punctuated equilibrium seems to be what the evidence bears out, because we have massive explosions of evolution after every major extinction event.
Right. I think the gradualism is pretty much dead. I mean, as a permanent, as a total solution. I mean, Darwin himself thought that gradualism was essential to his theory, but he knew there was so much he didn't know about that it would be remarkable if he got everything right. And he got that one wrong, because there's so many examples of non-gradualism, the ones that Gould gave for his theory, and now there are many others that have been coming up. So I don't think there's any question that some form of punctuated equilibrium is the right way to go. But as you said,
it's interesting you brought up Darwin too, because Christians love to attack Darwin, oh, Darwin had faith in God and Darwin got this wrong, and yeah, of course he fucking got this, that, and the other wrong. It was the first talk about the idea in any length, and he himself, number one, he was a theist, which a lot of people like to point out, but it legit he was, and number two, he did not think that his theories were incompatible with other things, but Galileo got shit wrong. Right? Einstein got shit wrong. As soon as we found out, his theories of relativity are still huge, but there's a lot of incompatibilities with what we now understand of quantum physics. So any, if you point to any originator in any field for any particular idea, there's bound to be shit they get wrong. That's the point of science. The point of science is to find the places where you're wrong and to find better explanations and to refine your theories.
Yeah. I mean, I even got something wrong once.
Oh wow, you admitted it on stream even. Are you sure your pride's going to be able to survive that?
As a matter of fact, all kidding aside, I was senior author. I think I was senior author on a paper that said something that turned out was disproven about a few months later by two very good friends of mine. And you're right. That I didn't. It's not a problem. I didn't make any mistakes. I just went to publication a little too soon because I didn't have enough data. So, and that's happened to all kinds of people. I mean, recently, speaking of origin of life, there was a paper that had to be retracted by one of the great scientists in the field, Jack Szostak, who won a Nobel Prize for something else. And they published a paper showing how RNA could self-replicate itself using not proteins, which probably didn't exist, but using smaller, what's called polypeptides, which is small, very, very small proteins, which probably did exist. So that looked great. When I saw that, I said, well, that's a big step. That really is a big step. It turns out it was wrong. It was an artifact. It was a laboratory mistake, and he had to retract the paper. So,
well,
that's science.
Well, but yeah, that's part of science though, is admitting when you fuck up. And I
Oh,
mean,
you
like
have to.
psychology,
Yeah.
psychology and nutrition both just went through major replicability crises, and like a lot of people are trying to discredit
Both. Yeah.
entire fields on those grounds, but that doesn't necessarily, like, that doesn't discredit an entire field so much as it's part of the self-correction process. It's part of what peer review is supposed to take care of.
Yeah.
And when, peer review fucks up, then at that point it's up to the field to incentivize for people to double check and triple check results.
Yeah. And we move forward, but fairly slowly, and we get to go through a lot of false starts. I wasted 6 months or so trying to replicate something that was done, published in Nature, which is one of the top journals in science. And this is early on in my career. And I thought, oh, this is really exciting. And it turned out it was all wrong. That happens. I mean, it's just nothing you can do. I mean, I used to tell my grad students, if you're successful 10% of the time, that's fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot
Like
of
10% of
failure.
the time, that sounds like a little high to me. But again, like the particular background that I have is it's contentious. But like you had said earlier, you wanted to talk a little bit. So what specifically within like the philosophy of science? We've been kind of discussing that this whole time, right? Like we've been
Yeah.
talking about replicability and testability, what
Yeah. I
science
started.
is and isn't, and whether or not it deals in absolutes. So what is it specifically that you had in mind when you said
So I
that?
started because I started mentioning that I was reading Penrose, and the story of reality, I think it's called something like that.
Mm-hmm.
It's 1,020 pages, and it's very dense. So I'm not really reading it; I'm skimming through it, but it is confirming a feeling I've had. And I'm not a physicist, so my knowledge of physics is educated layman. But I've been having this feeling for quite some time, and I know it's true in biology, and it seems to be definitely true in physics as well, that we're in a different stage in this last 100 years than we were before that. Because before the beginning of the 20th century, so much progress was being made. Every time people did another experiment or were able to make a step forward, it brought everything clearer into focus. It looked like we were really going to answer everything pretty quickly. And Maxwell with his equations for electricity and magnetism was like this great major step forward, and there was only like very little left that didn't seem to be easy to understand. And part of that included everything in biology. But you have to remember that biology was actually not considered science at some point. It was actually considered part of metaphysics
I mean,
because
well,
it
to
was
be
so
fair,
hard.
and also for a long time, most branches of science were actually part of philosophy. Like,
Mm-hmm.
when you go back all the way to the ancient Greeks, even
Yep.
where, obviously there have been versions of science that have been tied to religion throughout all of history. Like, for example, the Mayans had a more advanced understanding of astronomy than most so-called Western civilizations. Like their calendars were, even more accurate down to the second than the one we use today. And they used it because they were obsessed with the stars. They had religious reasons behind it, but they understood the placement of the stars and the movement of things through the sky. They didn't understand what the stars were, but they understood things about them and were able to track them. And that's their own form of science, but it was tied to their religion.
Right.
In ancient
Right.
Greece, you had the different branches of philosophy. You had, the ethike, you had physike, and you had I'm trying to remember what the other one is. It's logicae was the other one, and physike was basically what we would call science. It was all the naturalistic sort of explanations for things. It was the way that the different philosophical branches would investigate the world, and that's kind of where a lot of the foundations of what we consider to be the scientific method sort of sprung from.
Right. I'm not sure what Athena is asking about. Which book is that?
The book that you had mentioned.
Oh no, it's not 108. It's a different book. Then the story of reality is. I have it right on. I don't know if but the book I'm talking about is definitely over 1,000 pages. It's really huge. Maybe there's
Pembrose.
a condensed version. I don't know.
Pembrose is the author, Athena, if you're looking for it.
It's Roger Penrose.
Penrose. But anyway, you were saying about like it looked like we were making exponential leaps.
Yeah, and what's happened, and so everything other than biology, the other big mystery was light. Nobody could understand how light worked, and there was this theory of the ether, and what happened was that it was determined that there was some very strange things about the speed of light, that it was constant. It didn't matter whether you were going toward it or away from it. It was always the same speed, and that didn't seem to make any sense. And then, of course, we had the 20th century, and in 1905, Einstein solved that with special relativity.
Mm-hmm.
And the result of that was that time is not constant. Time changes depending how fast you go. So if you're on a very fast spaceship, time literally slows down. It's not just a feeling that it actually does slow. And that was very counterintuitive and got a lot of people upset, but it was true. It is measurably true. And that was only the beginning, because throughout the beginning of the 20th century, with quantum mechanics and general relativity and later particle physics and all of that, there was all of this new stuff coming, which didn't really help add to a coherent, unified picture of the world. It kind of did the opposite. It raised lots of questions. What's really going on? And what I got from reading Penrose, and I believe this book was published in 2012 or 14, I don't remember, it's not that long ago, is that situation has not gotten any better. If anything, it's gotten worse. No one has been able to put quantum theory and gravitation together. That just seems to be almost mathematically impossible. The particle physics folks are not happy with the latest results. String theory, well, Penrose doesn't believe it, but some people do. Anyway,
string theory is untestable. Like, it's not even
exactly.
I love string theory. I love reading it. I've actually, my novel that I'm working on right now, the sequel to my series, is based in it, and I have a buddy who's an astrophysicist who helped me understand bits of it in order to be able to use it. But like, string theory is... The problem with it is that it's untestable. That's the issue. Like, you can say it works on the mathematical level, but you can say anything works on the mathematical level to a certain degree. Like, you can get it to work, and that doesn't necessarily mean you've got any way to verify it. So it's about as useful explanatorily as a deity is.
Yeah, and a lot of people say that. And what Penrose doesn't cover, of course, but what I know a little bit more about is biology, which I think is starting to go through the same thing. And part of it is the abiogenesis problem. But even beyond that, we keep finding out things that are very surprising and that really raise more questions than they answer. We don't know how it could possibly be true that humans have fewer genes than rice or than many, insects. How does that work? I mean, we have so many things that we do that they don't. Don't we need genes for all of those? And the answer seems to be incredibly complicated, that probably the regulation, not only of one gene, but of a sequence of DNA, which can actually be several genes at once, depending on where you start. And that's just mind boggling. I mean,
the sheer amount of genetic code just needed for cell functioning, as far as we can understand, like a good chunk of our genetic code is just for that, right?
You mean a good chunk of our genetic information?
Like the genetic information that every cell has. Like, a lot of the DNA that we share with other life forms is just on the level of cell functioning.
Oh, the majority of it, sure. But when you think about, let's say, a human, but you can even use some animals, there's a whole set of neurological things that, for example, rice doesn't have. There's a lot of stuff going on in larger animals, and especially in humans, that you don't find in simpler organisms. So we would think we would have more genes, but we don't. We have a fairly small number. We don't understand that.
Well, I think that part of it, because this is not my field at all, but I do have friends who work in the field. I have friends who work specifically in, I guess, one of them is a dual major in agriculture and biochemistry, and I guess what she does primarily is she does work for ConAgra, like
Right.
doing genetic modification of plants. She said that part of the reason that plants need as many genes as they do, or at least what she thinks, is that she said that it has something to do with the fact that they don't have as many different specialized cell clusters as say animals do. Like she said that all of that information needs to be in every single cell. Like I don't
Oh,
remember
right,
what it
right.
was.
They're not as highly differentiated. That's right.
Correct.
Right.
And so she said something along those lines, like even a tiny modification in any part of that DNA, it affects the entire plant. Whereas, like they don't seem to have as many epigenetic controllers as we do, like to activate their genes and deactivate them, and so
Right.
having a bunch of extra genes. But also, plants are far more complex than I think we give them credit for. Like we're learning more and more about their ability to communicate even across species lines. Like there are plants that, when they get bit into by say an insect or another predator, will do almost like a chemical reaction that will tell them, based off of like whatever the juices that come off of that creature are, determine what the predator is, and then they release a pheromone that lets other nearby plants of the same species know that this predator is in the area, and another pheromone that will attract a predator to attack this thing that's eating them. And so I think they're not as simple. Plants are not as simple, I think, as we think.
Well, yeah, I mean, they've been around a long time, so that's true. They've had a lot of
evolving
time.
Longer than we have.
Exactly. So they've had time to develop all kinds of interesting stuff, which is fascinating. I don't know. All I'm saying is that was just an example for what I mean is that we're nowhere near the end of biology. I mean, we know a huge amount compared to what we knew, let's say, when I was born, which, it's a long time ago, but still not that long. And it's even with all that knowledge, we're just at the beginning. And so what I'm getting around to is it looks as if when we talk about what science is for, I mean, I think that most people would agree that science has some great technological aspects to it, right? It leads to all kinds of inventions and things that are very, very groovy. But I think the main reason that people do science is because they want to understand things about the world. It could be, the basics, where the world came from, or what life is, or how we function as living organisms. And it's beginning to seem to me that we maybe, and I don't know, I'm actually, this is a question for you. I wonder how you think about this. I sometimes think that we may be getting, it just seems to be getting harder and harder to get to those answers. And I'm wondering if we're going to eventually come up against some stone walls. I mean, I got the impression from Penrose that he thinks we're already there, that some of the questions that are arising in physics, he just doesn't seem optimistic that we'll get answers to them.
Well, I mean, there's also, like, given what we know about the expansion of the universe as well, there's a point where we'll stop being able to observe enough information to get answers to certain questions. Like, there's already, the boundary of what we can observe. We can only observe going back to 320,000 years or so after the expansionary event.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Anything before that, we are just physically incapable of seeing because we can't, there's no way to detect light from that long ago.
Right.
And on top of it, the expansion itself is separating us so much further that we're losing what we can see. So I think that there is a point that science will eventually hit, that where there's going to be less questions that we're able to answer than answers left. But I guess you said a lot there, so there's a lot to comment on. I think you're right. I think that ultimately what science is at its core is human seeking answers.
Right.
And I think that as a species, that's something that we've always done. I think that's something that, has made us unique in terms of the way that we function, is that we have that curiosity inbuilt into us. One of the things that I like to snark about is when you look, at the history of our species, one of the first things we did, we had paintings on cave walls before agriculture developed. We yearned to create stuff and figure out how things worked and, mimic our surroundings before we even figured out how to feed ourselves regularly. Right.
Right.
So I think that science at its core, I think people are never going to stop asking those questions and trying to find the answer to them. But I think also what you're talking about, where it feels like we're answering all of these questions and it's expanding, and we're getting more and more into minutia now versus kind of answering these bigger questions. I think that's kind of like the Dunning-Kruger effect. Also, the more you figure out, the more you find out you don't know, and the more, like, the further along in the path you get, the closer you feel to the beginning. Because as as you figure out more and more details about things, you just find all of the little areas. Now that you understand this, well, now there's 5 other questions that answer has now brought for you. I think that that's part of what makes science such a beautiful thing, right? To study, to practice, to be a part of in any way, shape, or form. Like, it is probably the crowning achievement of our species.
Oh yeah, and I mean it. I should mention that one of the other. I don't know if everyone would agree with me. Probably not, but I also, when we were talking about the limits of evolution, one of the things that I think evolution is has a very hard time understanding or explaining is the nature of humanity, because I agree that human beings have this drive to understand the world, and the evolutionary explanation for that I find very weak, and I've heard it from Dawkins and other people, and that is that it's selective advantage to know about your environment. So that then carries through into wanting to know more and more and more, and eventually turns into scientific curiosity. But I think that's a little bit grasping at straws. I'm not sure that we can use evolution to understand humanity as well as we can to understand, the biochemical and genetic changes that go on as creatures evolve. And for that whole question of what is driving us to try to understand as much as we can about our situation, ourselves, our world. I think that's another mystery. I don't know, what the background is for it. I mean, several people have proposed things, but to me, it doesn't add up as something that would really give a selective advantage. I like to tell a little story. If you have 2 tribes of humans. One are very good hunters, and they have already figured out how to hunt animals, and they're really good at it. And they go out every day and they hunt. And next door, you have another tribe of humans who are pretty good too, but they've evolved to reflect the way we are today. They're philosophical. They think. They have emotions that are complex, and they're about to go out to hunt. And one of the people says, I'm not in the mood today. I mean, I just don't want to bother. I don't feel like it. I have some really important thoughts going on, and it'll be distracting if I have to pick up my spear and go out hunting. And then they have an argument, and they get into a philosophical discussion of, what it means to be a hunter and be hunted. I don't know if that tribe is going to do better than the first one. I have a feeling they might do worse. So now that's a very silly example, but I think
was about to say that's a bit of an oversimplification.
Yeah, a little bit.
Well,
but I like to do that. I like to do that to make a point. I'm not sure.
My snarky response to that as somebody with an underdeveloped prefrontal cortex is, well, this is the reason why the limbic system can overpower the prefrontal cortex when it comes to survival type things. Mm-hmm. Eventually, all of their bellies are going to grumble and they're going to go fucking hunt, and all of the adrenaline systems and all that shit are going to push them into it. So yeah, and then they're going to get into a philosophical discussion about the hunt they just had and how they performed. So maybe they will have an advantage. It's just that limbic system is going to be the thing that saves them from themselves, right?
Possible, yeah.
I think that's the reason why ultimately, some of the cognitive biases that we see in people exist, why we have a survival bias. Like, you can't it's very hard to deliberately starve yourself to death, for example. Oh, yeah. That's because those older parts of the brain, like what makes humans unique is our prefrontal cortex, how developed it is, what it can do. Right. And the thing is, that prefrontal cortex, it can do all of those things when you're in a relative state of comfort, right? Like, it took us getting to the point where we were in a relative state of comfort. Like, many of our ancestors had similar cognitive structures to us, but, because of the fact that they had not gotten the socially passed down knowledge base that we have, they didn't live in the kind of comfort where they could use those parts of their brains as effectively as we do now. So, it's not as though they didn't have the capability of that. That philosophical tribe could have existed, but they would exist once their bellies were full. I don't think they'd have the debate before the hunt,
Interesting. Okay. I was just curious what you thought. And in fact, I have another question for you, because your worldview in addition to being scientific like mine, is also some form of theism. Is that correct? I mean,
Yeah,
you're a
I'm a Hellenist.
polytheist. So how do you reconcile your theism with science?
I don't think they're incompatible. One of the
Okay.
things that surprises a lot of people, at least the ones that aren't used to hearing me say it to people on our channel, is that I'm agnostic on whether or not the gods created the universe. They could have come into existence with the universe, and that makes no difference within my faith or my definition of them. I don't think that they have the demand to worship them that, say, the Christian God of the Bible, the way that many, Christians portray him, that he demands of his followers. Like, it seems to be a mutual sort of like relationship of respect and reciprocity between followers and the gods. I think, this is unverified personal gnosis. This is my opinion. But I think the gods took interest in us because of our reason, because of our minds, because of our curiosity. I think that they are
Hmm.
unevolved minds that noticed us on our little rock, and took interest in communicating with us because we had the ability to communicate, if that makes sense.
Yeah. No, that holds
That's
with a little bit that I know about Greek religion. It seems to fit. Yeah.
so, like, for me, that idea of, the omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent, etc., like, that doesn't quite jive with what I understand of my personal experiences with the gods. But I don't know, and I'm comfortable not knowing necessarily whether they created the universe or not, whether they created, say, morality or not, or other things. I just know that my faith enriches my life, and the practices that I do enrich my life.
Hmm.
And I know that I have what I consider to be personal experiences with them, and I have good reason to believe I've had personal experiences with them, so that's justification for me to believe. But I also don't think that my personal experiences are justifications for me to tell you to. You know what I mean?
Right. Right.
I can't say I've had this amazing experience with Athena, so therefore, and I'm talking about Goddess Athena, not Athena in the chat. Though, Athena, I did see your question. I just haven't had an opening to ask you. The answer to your question from me is define sentience, and maybe we'll try to have a conversation. But the problem with sentience is we haven't even figured out a proper definition for that in science yet. Like, we're still trying to figure out what the fuck life is.
Right. Well, yeah, that's another interesting issue in philosophy of science, is how incredibly important definitions are.
Mm-hmm.
Just the definition of species, for example, is very difficult, and there isn't really one, in addition to life and so many other things. So, yeah, what's a species? I mean, how do you tell when something is used to be simple. If they can interbreed, then they're two different. Then they're the same species. If they can't, they're not. And that has broken down. I mean, there are clearly different species by any other definition which can interbreed. So it's very complex. Definitions are the bane of biologists, and most of the time we just ignore it and say, "Well, we know what it is, so screw it."
Yeah, but like, astronomers and like astronauts, though, they need a functional definition of life for, if we're going to be, say, exploring Mars,
Right.
like, are we only going to recognize carbon and sulfur based life? Oh God, we talked about this earlier, Shay. Like, that's a dumpster fire comment right there. I see what you're doing. The answer is we don't know.
We don't know.
We don't, like, I don't know if I consider viruses to be alive. Like, they don't. This is that question of replication versus, cellular respiration
Right.
and metabolism. Like,
Right.
metabolism currently, most of the functional definitions of life that I've seen are metabolism based. Is that not correct? Like, most of the ones for describing life here, but when you're talking about NASA, like, that definition of life, if we encounter something that's not carbon or sulfur based, how the fuck are we going to recognize it as life?
Yeah, I get that question a lot, and I have a kind of a unusual answer, and I haven't seen too many other people use it. I use it because my original training was in chemistry, and just from a chemist's point of view, I have a very hard time even imagining what kind of life. Because one thing about life that we know, it's not a definition, but it's absolutely true for all life, is complexity. There's no such thing as simple life, chemically simple. It's not enough to take 10 chemicals or 1,000 chemicals and mix them together. There have to be interactions. There have to be all kinds of, bonding and things that really require carbon pretty much. And so I would be very conservative when it comes to finding anything out there that you could call alive that was not based on carbon. I'm just very skeptical on that.
Well, I mean, there are sulfur-based life forms, though, and sulfur-metabolizing life forms that are found in, like, deep ocean vents and things.
They're not sulfur based. They use sulfur, but the life forms are based on carbon.
Oh, that's fair. I think, though, what would be interesting, it makes me wonder if, like people often talk about fine tuning and stuff and the fundamental constants. It makes me wonder if it is possible for there to be other, say, bases that could create complex chemical structures similar to what we see in carbon-based life forms. Like, it could be a bit of observation bias on our part, right? Like, we are carbon-based life forms that are doing these experiments on a planet that has been overtaken by carbon-based life forms. For all we know, there's some nutso shit going on Venus that, like, has created a sulfuric acid atmosphere, and there might be something on there that we can't see that has some sort of complex chemical thing that we can't absorb because we're not there to see those chemicals.
I guess I can't say it's impossible. I mean, I think it's certainly possible that it could be other universes if the multiverse is true, where even the rules of chemistry are different, and they could be different chemicals. They could be just, if the laws of physics are really different in different universes, then all bets are off, because we don't even know what atoms would exist in that case, or what atoms would look like. They may not look anything like they are here. So yeah,
well,
in that case,
we have some very interesting evidence for multiverse theory too. Dark flow, I think, is one of the most compelling bits that I've seen. My astrophysics buddy pointed that out before Knox debate recently. The idea that there's these anomalies in the movements of galaxies that we're observing where they're getting pulled in a particular direction, and we cannot explain why, because the only explanation appears to be something outside the universe that might be acting either gravitationally on it, or something got disrupted during the expansionary period that caused those things. Like, we have no fucking clue, but like that multiverse theory, that seems to be some level of evidence for it, whether you call it compelling or not, it's definitely interesting.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that I meant when I was talking about all these amazingly hard questions that are popping up now from the data that we have. In other words, every time we do these kinds of observations or astronomical experiments, or astronomical observations, or whatever, we get results apparently that are just, they're not very satisfying. They don't tell us, oh, so that's the answer. They basically say, now what the hell is going on here? And the dark flow is the latest, but the whole the rapid expansion of the universe, all the galaxies are being pulled away from each other. Who expected that? That just doesn't, that doesn't compute. So
there's an interesting question in the chat that I would like to answer really quick. Pitcher plants and Venus flytraps exist. Why not sheep-eating plants? Simple, actually. The saturation of oxygen and carbon dioxide currently present in our atmosphere does not allow for plants over a certain size. That's why.
Or insects.
Or insects, or anything, actually. There was a time where we had a much higher saturation of both carbon dioxide and oxygen in our atmosphere, and that's why we got shit like dinosaurs. But, like, currently, we do not have a high enough concentration of either of those gases to support plants that large that could digest, a critter like that.
Right.
But there was a time, actually, in our Earth's history where we had massive, massive fungi that would be like the size almost of the Empire State Building, and that's fascinating.
Well, I think what you just said is very interesting, because it kind of illustrates what I had just said, that there are some things that we know probably cannot exist because of what we know about the geochemistry and the atmospheric chemistry of our planet. Mm-hmm. And so if you extrapolate that a little bit more, all I'm saying is there are probably some things that wouldn't exist on any planet, like, complex life forms based on silicon. I mean, it just doesn't have the bonding capacity that carbon does. It just doesn't. It's hard to get very complicated molecules out of silicon.
So somewhere in California, you just broke James Cameron's heart.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry, that was an Aliens joke, if you didn't catch it.
I got the gist, yes.
I'm a huge fan of that series. I'm sorry.
I mean, I love science fiction. It was the first thing I ever read when I was a kid. Not as much as I used to love it, but and what's good about science fiction, if it's done well, is it opens your mind to new things, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I don't like science fiction that uses scientific principles that are wrong. I mean, it's just, that bothers me because, or that we, at least that we know are wrong. Sometimes we're not sure, but there are a few things that we actually do know. And I think one of them is that, life is complex, and the only chemistry that will give you complex life is based on carbon. They'll give you complex molecules.
So Athena asks there was if that there was only one universe where there are multiple planets, stars, and galaxies doesn't make sense to me. Why wouldn't the pattern repeat? The answer is we don't know if there are other universes. Like there appears to be something outside of our universe that is pulling on gravitationally on parts of our universe, and we can't really explain what it is other than maybe another universe, or maybe we're expanding into a universe that used to be. That's one of those questions that we don't have an answer to. We have a lot of theoretical models that propose things that could be answers to it, and that's part of where string theory often is. People start talking about that because it's one of the most fleshed out models we have for how other universes could come into being, but we don't have absolute answers to those. In fact, like again, we don't really have absolute answers to much. We just have a lot of probable explanations. But that's one of those questions that we just don't have enough information on yet to be able to answer. We don't know if there's other universes. There could be. There could be a whole bunch of them that, because of quantum fluctuations blew apart or collapsed in on themselves before they could do anything. There could also be ones that have slightly different fluctuations of their fundamental constants and look a lot like this universe, where there's forms of life that are similar to us that are asking these exact same questions. We don't know.
Right. Well, I like the idea that there's an infinite multiverse, so that there's an infinite number of universes just like ours, except, I'm not bald, for example. And maybe there's a whole bunch of universes like that. We don't know.
So Leah Bryant asks, do you think that non-carbon based life is possible? Now, keep in mind, my background again is in nutrition, so I have enough knowledge on this to kind of have a conversation with somebody who knows something about it, but I don't know enough to be authoritative. Sai, earlier you said that you didn't think that it was possible just because of the particulars of the way that carbon functions chemically. Do you want to expand on that a little bit for the audience?
Yeah. So questions? Carbon is the only element in that we know that exists that can form 4 bonds, covalent bonds with other atoms, including itself. And usually in life, it forms these bonds with hydrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, sulfur.
Well, and carbon chemically is very unique in the sense of, it's like the way that it, the charges on it and the way that it operates in terms of chemical reactions allows it to do a lot of things that other elements just can't.
That's right. And that's a function of its atomic number. Its atomic number is 6. And because of very complicated quantum physics theories, which I can't get into, 2 of those electrons are what's called in the inner energy shell, and the other 4 are on the outer edge, and they are able, each one of those can bind to another electron from another atom. So that gives carbon uniquely the ability to form these strong bonds. They're not bonds like sodium chloride. They're very strong covalent bonds between each carbon atom and 4 other different things. That means the number of potential molecules that can come from carbon is, almost infinite. I mean, it's just vast. And the number of molecules that exist in life is in the billions. So then the question is, could anything else do? Do you need that? Do you need that to have life? And I think the answer is yes, because as I said before, you got to have very complex chemistry. You can't just have, 20 humdrum small molecules. You have to have large polymers. You have to have all kinds of smaller molecules that interact. It's it's
I
an
think it
incredibly
comes back to
complex
the way
system.
you define life again. Like, complexity seems to be a feature of life. It's definitely an observational.
Right.
But, this is where, when you start talking about abiogenesis, one of the things that a lot of books on abiogenesis in particular go into, and I saw Mr. Parker's question in the side chat. Thanks, Knock, for popping it up there. We're going to get to it in a second, but I want to kind of try to finish this one because this is where people want direct answers from science, I think. And it's very, very hard to give them when you're still even trying to figure out a definition. When you start looking into abiogenesis, you read any sort of books written for the lay public on it, the first thing they'll start to get into is, do you have a descriptive definition for life, or do you have a prescriptive definition for life? Do we want to say that all life we observe has these, traits, like you said, complexity being a
Right.
trait that you observe in life, versus do you want to say that life must have these traits, e.g., the prescriptive definition, the definitions that rely on replicability versus, metabolism versus both versus, is evolution is that a requirement for life? Like right now, evolution is a requirement for life, like the capability of it. That's what makes a, say, quartz crystal not life and a virus maybe life. So like that's where, when you're starting to answer these questions, you kind of have to throw your hands up after a little while. Like, you have to make an arbitrary decision at some point about whether you're going to try to do a prescriptive definition or a descriptive definition, and then move on from there. If the only life that we could recognize must be complex, it must be capable of evolutionary change through, random mutation and things of that nature, it must be replicable, it must be, then that limits what you can call life.
That's true.
But there's also the possibility of encountering something that we might recognize as life if we were to open ourselves up beyond that. So it's difficult to say because we haven't encountered anything outside of our own little ecosphere. And I think that that's where, you have to kind of admit defeat a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's true. I've heard people say, well, there could be life that's just, energy based. There's no actual molecules at all. And yeah, there could be. I don't know how we would know it, how we would see it or recognize it. But yeah, that could be right. Certainly in theology, we're not limited in the way that I'm talking about. But again, that's kind of outside of my grasp. I don't know how to look at something and say, well, that's alive, when it's not, as you just said, when it's not something that's familiar to me as life. So I guess that we'll just have to wait and see what develops. But I don't think either of us will ever see that. That'll be a long time from now.
Yeah, I think that it's fascinating to talk about, though. And I think that ultimately what you are getting into there is philosophy, right? Like,
Yeah.
are we describing what we see,
Right.
or are we trying to create a definition that can include things that we don't see? A lot of people bring science fiction in when you start talking about definitions for
Right.
life. Something like Athena and I were talking the other day. He mentioned the Q continuum, as a form of life. That's an energetic form of life that could potentially interact with us through like sparking in our brain and things of that nature. But would Q be alive or not? Like that's a really interesting question to try to debate just on a philosophical level. I think, when you're talking about science, a lot of the time science errs towards practicability. So like it's possible we could encounter something like a Q, but I don't think we have to discuss that until we do. And so for right now, generally what we have are descriptive definitions.
Yeah, that's right. But it's always very tempting to go towards prescriptive things too, because as you said, that's what our brains like to do. we like to be able to make, definitive statements about the nature of reality as much as we can.
So Mr. Parker asked earlier if sentience requires the registration of pain. I would say probably not, for an argument that somebody else in the chat gave you, and that is there are humans and animals that have like gene mutations that make it so they can't register pain. Like there are humans that can end up with brain damage in particular regions of the brain that makes it so you can't register pain. Does that mean that they are no longer self-aware? I think, again, sentience is another one of those philosophical things that you start to get into a fight like with each other about. Like, is the mirror test a registration for sentience? Is sentience self-awareness? Like, can a cat, for example, that does not recognize its own reflection in the mirror still understand the limitations of its own body? And is that a form of sentience? Like, it knows this tail is mine and that plushie there is not. That is not a part of me. So like, is that a form of self-awareness? Like, it's very difficult to actually describe that. I do not, however, believe that life would require sentience, as to your second question, because, like, as far as we can tell, like, single-celled organisms are not sentient. Like, they're not self-aware. That's something we can tell.
Well, that's that's interesting. That may not be completely right. It's incredible. I've been recently reading a lot of stuff about single cell intelligence.
Really?
Yeah, and in fact, they have it.
I gotta hear about this.
Okay, so there's an incredible TED talk. I can't remember the name. It's a woman scientist who is. I say that because it might be easier to find her. I wish I could remember her name. She has a whole TED talk on single cell intelligence, and it's remarkable because what it is she finds she's done experiments with bacteria, and what they do is when there's a threat, like, I don't know, some hostile bacteria arrives, they get together and they form structures that can, pretty much like what you said about plants, by the way. In fact, the mechanisms may be the same. What single cells and plants have in common is that they don't have any neural pathways. So they don't have nerves, they don't have brains, but what they do have is chemical signaling. Mm-hmm. And what they do is the individual cells in a bacterial colony or in a mold or things like that communicate with each other by chemical signals. And the result is the group of bacteria do things that look as if they're smart. It look as if they're responding to the environment and they're acting on it. Just as your example of a plant, which gets bitten and then chemical signals go from one cell to the next and things happen. So intelligence, as we think of it.
How do we even define it? We're back to definitions again.
Back to definitions, exactly. Because if we define intelligence as the human or animal kind of intelligence, you sense something, you see it, smell it, hear it, whatever, and then you take action to, that's appropriate for that stimulus. That's sensory, that's neural. But if you don't have a nervous system, you can still get these signals from chemicals in the environment. And for example, in aquatic environments, chemicals travel very quickly between different cells if they're close enough. So that kind of if you define intelligence as the ability to respond and take action based on either an opportunity or a threat. So in other words, if there's a food source over there and you get a signal from one of your, colleague bacteria, there's food over there, you go to that food and you get it. Is that smart? Yeah, it's kind of smart, right? It's not just random drifting around. There's actually purpose and direction. So if you define intelligence that way, it goes all the way down to bugs, to bacteria, not bugs. I mean, bacterial.
The colloquial use of the
single
word
cell,
bug, right?
Colloquial, right? So single cell organisms without anything like a nervous system have this kind in a group have this kind of very odd intelligence. And you were talking about plants, and that's exactly right. It's the same kind of thing.
Well, and I think that's where you start again. You get into like these really intricate definitions of even something like consciousness. Like, there's a brilliant book, I feel like I just need to start building a reading list, like the Garte discussion reading list, because we just keep referencing all these books we've read. This one's very much written for the lay public, but it presents a lot of research over several decades in a very readable way. I think it's, are we smart enough to know how intelligent animals are? And
I've heard of that.
Yeah, it's a discussion about like how, cows make friends, crows,
right.
Like crows use technology and experiment and hold funerals. How can we tell what's instinctual and what's intelligence? And is there a difference between instinct and intelligence? Kind of like, we came back earlier to a different point of contention we had about, like, can evolution explain, can biology and evolution explain some of our behaviors? I think it can to a certain degree, because we observe a lot of our own behaviors in the animal world. And also because when you look at the structures of the brain, like the parts of us that make us unique, like, the prefrontal cortex and the quote higher functions of the brain, those functions appear to be layered on top of, the older functions, on the things that we share with other animals.
Right.
Like, they're newer and they're less powerful. We were talking earlier about the limbic system can't overpower your, you can't get into a philosophical argument and starve yourself. You could try, but eventually your limbic system's going to be like, get the fuck out there and, throw your spear at something, you idiot.
Right.
So I think to a certain degree, a lot of that stuff can be explained by evolution, but I don't think that necessarily like eliminates some of the prospects that we've talked about before. I mean, in a future discussion, we can probably get into a definition of whether or not particular religious ideas can apply, but I don't think that science and religion are completely incompatible. And I think that, I think to try to say they are it's fighting the wrong fight. I think trying to force science and religion to be compatible is still fighting the wrong fight.
Oh, absolutely. No, I agree with that. I think I'm hearing, so I'm just going to see if I can. Is there any problem with my internet?
We've been getting a little bit of lag here and there, but you're actually getting some weird clicking with your audio now.
I hear that now. I don't know what that's coming from. Oh, it just stopped.
Is that better?
Okay.
I wonder if it was some kind of feedback.
Yeah. Well, is it okay now? Everything is.
Yeah, everything's better.
See and hear. Okay.
We've had a couple of hiccups here and there. It might have been your net. It might have also been YouTube or StreamYard, because the internet, all of these different server companies have been really overloaded ever since.
Yeah. No kidding. Right.
Because nobody's got anything better than to sit around, fucking watching YouTube, right?
Yep,
even YouTube's been glitchy. So.
Oh, I should mention my channel then, in case anyone's bored.
Yeah, go ahead.
It's called Faithful Science.
Again. Faithful Science.
Science is spelled, and I have. Boy.
Oh, you glitched out again.
Let me see if I can.
On my end.
Yeah, let me see if I can change my. Oh boy. I don't know. Well, we may have to say goodnight.
Oh, well, you're coming through clear again, it looks like. So
okay. Well,
Science spelled with just like an SY like your name?
Right. That's the idea. And it has 3 videos on DNA, pure science. There's a couple of videos about science and faith. There's one that has several of my discussions with atheists. I don't remember everything else that's on there, but there's a few interesting videos, so people can take a look. I'm going to be posting what evolution is not and what it is. And I'm going to be posting 2 more science videos, one on proteins and enzymes and one on protein synthesis. And then I'm going to leave that alone. I just want people to have a resource so they can find out what an allele is, or, whatever, all the stuff in biology that's of interest. So that's that channel.
Yeah, I think that's a great thing. We love having scientists on our channel to, describe this stuff. But I think that the more of you guys that have your own platforms to kind of discuss these things, I think that's really important, getting that stuff from the source, so to speak, from experts who actually understand it, because as many of us as are geeks in these sorts of things, we just had a lively discussion. I explained a lot of stuff. I clearly understand it, but not to the level that you do working in this field. If I start talking about chemistry, we can have a conversation up to a certain point, but there's a point where you're going to know way more than I do, and you'll be able to get more into the weeds. So
I think you probably know more physics than I do.
Maybe, I probably know more geology, to be honest, and nutrition. Those 2.
Oh, that's for sure. I know nothing of.
But I'm so thank you so much for coming on. You're starting to have some tech issues, so we said we were probably going to go a little over an hour. We're hitting that point where we actually hit almost an hour and a half, because we enjoyed talking to each other so much. So I said we were going to geek out. We got to do that, and that was a lot of fun. Thank you so much for having a great conversation, and actually, even being willing to come on here after having had a debate in the past, where we got a little bit heated toward the end, and yet we still had a great conversation. Like, I'm really grateful for your willingness to come and to just chat and like be, have some fun together. Like, it's been wonderful. I've really enjoyed it.
Great.
I hope we can have you on again sometime.
Sure, absolutely. Be happy to.
Yeah, I just wanted to pop in before you left, Sai, and just thank you for coming. And this was a wonderful conversation, and it's really where we're trying to take this channel. So I just wanted to thank you personally for coming on tonight and having this conversation with Ali.
Well, thank you for having me. I enjoyed it. I actually enjoyed the last one too, even though we I don't remember what the disagreement was on, but it was something theological, I'm sure.
It was Jesus being the final word on morality, and we got into it about slavery.
Oh, yeah. Okay, right. That's not my favorite topic. I sometimes get onto discussions which sometimes I don't even know what the discussion is going to be, and sometimes I do know, but I think I can somehow weasel out of it, but I usually can't. So.
Yeah, I just rush into discussions, just bullheaded. Like, I'm going to do it whether I know it or not, and then I try to catch up.
Oh, dude, I spent if there's one thing Knock it's intellectually honest. I spent 3 hours telling him how bad he is at debate yesterday, and he took it like a champ.
I like hearing the criticism. It's the only way you're going to learn. Go through it. Like, don't run away from it. All right, I messed up here. Let's talk about it.
Well, that's interesting. I should warn anyone who looks at my channel, my YouTube channel. I'm pretty good at talking, and I've done a lot of talking. As a scientist, I presented hundreds of papers. I don't know how many. What I'm terrible at, and I didn't know this till I started doing a YouTube channel, I can't read out loud. I tried to read a script. It comes out. People have said I sound like I'm a funeral director or.
Yeah, that's me. I cannot read a script.
I can't read a script. It's amazing. What I have to do is have to look at the script, try to think about it, and because I think about what I do when I give a science talk. What all scientists do is we show slides and then we talk about the slides. There's no script. You never read anything, and so I don't know. I can't do it. It sounds awful. So I have to work on that.
Yeah, I do too. I totally can relate with that. Ali's still trying to edit down my horrible script speaking abilities. I'm drinking flavored water, and I'm like, it looks like I've got a Kool-Aid mustache.
I'm not sure if it's possible to fix that, to be fair. Knock's entire content creation strategy is to talk in the direction of the camera and then just keep editing until it makes sense.
Yeah, that's kind of what I do. I just talk at the camera and then edit it all down.
I think that's what I'm going to have to. I'll have to use like 3 or 4 versions, and then whichever one sounds least wooden, I'll use. Because if you listen to some of my early videos, it's painful.
But
the videos are good, so
But seriously, Sai, thank you again so much for coming on.
Great.
I'm hoping that, maybe sometime in the future, maybe we can end up talking a little bit about theology, or I actually do have your book on. It's currently on hold at my library just because, everybody's tight money-wise, but I do plan on reading it at some point. Might even do a series of reviews on the channel just because I'm planning on doing that as part of my series that I'm going to be launching fairly soon, reading various books by theists. And yours in particular interests me because it's a story that's often told, but I think is not as often true. People who are raised atheists, because there's not a lot of people who were actually raised atheist.
Not the way I was.
Fewer of them go, even fewer of them go into theism. My husband was actually one of them. He was raised agnostic. His dad was Christian, but his mom was not.
Mm-hmm.
And so he was raised out of religion, and he himself stays agnostic. He jokes that gods keep knocking, and that nobody's home.
Right.
But
so if you
it's an interesting story.
If you go to my website, just look for the worksofhishands.com. You'll find a contact page, and there you can send me your address, and I'll send you a book.
Oh, thank you. That's actually really kind of you. We actually are currently in correspondence. I could just reply to our current thread, and I could send you my address through that.
Okay, that's true. Right.
We did have a scientist in Doc Savage. I'm not sure if you know him. But he wanted to come on and talk to you, and I'm like, oh, we're not doing that now, but maybe next time you come on, we can make that happen.
Yeah, the name is familiar. Absolutely. And I also saw a comment from I think it's Raging Atheist about coming onto a channel. I think he and I have had some
Raging
interesting.
atheist is the person you're talking to.
Yeah, I'm a raging atheist.
You're a raging atheist.
Yeah.
I didn't know that. Okay, so wow, so because we've had some interesting discussions on Twitter.
Have we?
Yeah, I believe so. Do you follow me on Twitter?
I follow you, but I don't really.
Just a couple. I mean, I've been very
maybe way back in the day when I was like a.
No,
this
this
is
is
angry
recent.
motherfucker.
Maybe someone else is using that name.
Yeah,
I'll look for it. I'll look for it.
Yeah, I do follow you on Twitter, but I usually don't interact too much on Twitter. So unless I used to be a drunk, so if I was drunk, don't judge me for it.
No, this is very recent, and I'll look for it, and I'll DM.
Oh yeah,
you.
yeah, definitely.
This was you, and I was very impressed with your comments, if I remember right.
Oh, well, thank you. Okay. I do try to be like really fair. I'm not like I used to be. I used to be really anti-theist. If you believed in religion, I didn't like it. But I've changed drastically because I realized I was just being stupid and raging. And
well, that doesn't even bother me. I mean, I'm fairly close with Aaron Ra, who is
yeah. Well, I call him like the original one. He's the original raging atheist. Yeah,
exactly. So, and we're actually buddies more or less.
Yeah. Oh man, I was super excited. I was kind of commenting in the chat earlier. I was like, the best thing about doing YouTube now is I'm meeting people that I used to watch all the time. Like I remember watching you on a couple non sequitur shows, and it's like now he's on my channel. Talking to my co-host. This is pretty awesome.
Well, thank you. I don't. I'm just a guy. I mean, I don't think there's anything special about me, but anyway.
Well, I mean, what's special about you is and now we're back to Dunning-Kruger, right? What's special about you is the sheer breadth of knowledge that you've acquired through the years, as a scientist, but also being a scientist that's willing to come onto a tiny ass little YouTube channel like this and have a conversation as wide and as deep as the one we just had. Like, that's what makes you special. Like,
yeah, it was a really good conversation. The chat loved it.
It's a lot of fun.
So thank you so much again. I hope that we can have you on again sometime.
Sure.
Like I said, I'll get you my address so that I can get that book to get a chance to take a look at it. I've had it on hold on the library for like 2 weeks.
I just have to figure out when I'm going to get to the post office, but that'll happen eventually. So yeah, but you might as well. That way, at least you have it. You can write on it. You don't have to give it back. So.
Well, and thank you so much. And now you guys got a chance to meet. Maybe next time we can talk about theology or something a little more contentious. Sure. But honestly, like, I'm sick. I didn't want to get into any kind of argument or anything like that. I just wanted to geek out. And I think we got to do that. And that was a lot of fun because I think we agree on more than we disagree on. And I think that's something that we don't focus on a lot on YouTube. I think there's a lot of sort of the debate culture and stuff like that. But when you have somebody who is part of this community who's willing to come on and be like, yeah, not only do I believe in evolution, I think that all the people who don't are kind of silly, and here's why. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding and miseducation, and here's why. And you can have that convo. I think that it's important to platform those people and to have those conversations. I think it's just as important to get along sometimes as it is to get into a dumpster fire. I
agree.
Yeah. And I enjoy people. You seem like the type of person that you could get into a really contentious argument with, and then the next day be perfectly fine with each other. So
yeah, well, that the part of that is just my scientific background. I mean, if you go to a scientific meeting, you go to a table in a restaurant with 6 people yelling and screaming at each other and out at the table, and they're the best of friends, and they just disagree on the structure of a particular enzyme or something, and it's passionate on all sides, and then then it's over. I mean, it doesn't mean it.
You get the same thing in philosophy, though. Like, I've gotten into you have no idea how many angry Platonists messaged me after our Hellenism stream. Like, motherfucker, man! Like, this is what I call stoic. Like, bitches, I'm a fucking stoic. Like, I can point out all the holes in your arguments, and y'all are the ones who have to go and, deal with that. But, like, we got into these passionate fucking arguments, but at the end, we were fine with each other. But, like, my inbox was flooded for a couple of days.
Yeah, I bet.
So, I mean, I think that you get a thicker skin after a while if you're okay with being wrong sometimes, or with understanding that some questions don't have an absolute answer.
That's right. And you can always learn even from people you don't agree with.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly.
If they're smart and they know and they're thoughtful and they're committed to discourse and to understanding, you can learn from everybody. So why not?
So yeah, but I mean, again, thank you again so much for coming on. Like, I
All
really
right.
enjoyed this conversation, and I
Okay.
guess Naka's probably going to be the one closing out. You're the one who has to do that. Thanks, guys, for being here. Like everybody in the chat, this is my first time hosting, so I totally fucked up my intro, but I'm gonna get used to it someday. Nox said that he wants to be able to have a few more solo type conversation type things where he goes back and he produces in the background. So thank you for everybody who did decide to join and watch this one. You know, we're gonna have probably lots of conversations in the future, I hope. And remember, guys, be the conversation.
All right. See y'all later.